This video is about conversations, and conversations are a tricky beast because you can have very simple, straightforward conversations, but you can also have extremely complex conversations, and it's not immediately clear from the beginning if your conversation that you have in mind will be simple or complex. So I will show you a few different ways of doing stuff with conversations in the game engine. The first thing you'll probably want to do is to select Game here, pick the Features tab, and select Ask and Tell. I don't know why they're turned off from the beginning, but they are, so it's very important that you turn them on. That will allow you to do things very easily that are otherwise extremely complex later on. If you select a non-player character, you will see that because we turn that feature on, it will have a specific tab for Ask and Tell, which is different from other verbs like talk to, speak to. When it comes to the verbs, speak to, talk to is the, of course, most straightforward way of interacting with someone. When you speak to someone, you can run a script, and you can make those scripts as complex as you would like, print messages and all that. But this very quickly becomes quite elaborate and complex for you to program. So I would like to show you another function that will do this more easily for you. Unfortunately, that means it's slightly less straightforward for the player of your game. Go to Ask and Tell. You will see here that I've created a few different, a bit of a sample code here. So for Ask, what you could do, which is very useful, is you could create various topics to choose between. So you can ask the non-player characters about the topics you've specified. You can create as many topics as you would like and specify what happens if you ask about that specific topic. This makes it very useful and straightforward for you to create branching conversations very easily. Here, for instance, I've asked about Fallout 76, and a conversation will start or commence when we do that. If Fallout 76 is the only Fallout game I have as a topic, just typing Fallout in the game itself will work just fine. So when you ask about Fallout 76, you have a series of messages. Of course, you could just print a lot of messages, one each for the various things you're talking about, or the responses and questions that are part of the conversation. The problem with doing that, however, and it's a fairly major problem, and that is that when everything appeared once, you will not feel, when you're reading this, you won't feel that this is a conversation with a specific flow. It will just feel like text. The way to get around that is to add timers between the question and responses. Because when we are talking to people in real life, we don't expect an answer immediately. When we're programming, for instance, chatbots, they are programmed to not reply to your questions immediately. They will have like some sort of animation or something that shows us that it's thinking. Of course, a computer doesn't need to think. If it understands something, the response will be available to the computer instantly, almost. But if the computer answers your question within like a millisecond, which is perfectly possible, technically, it feels weird because it doesn't feel like a conversation. We're used to conversations having this specific flow with pauses between the interactions. To simulate that, add timers. It's easy. Just add a new script, and instead of just printing a message, click timers and select which timer function would you like to use. And that allows you to run a script after a set number of seconds. Allowing for a few seconds to pass makes this text block turn into conversation. It's actually very powerful. One thing to keep in mind here is that when you're adding a timer like this, each instance of the timer counts from 0. So if you have 2 seconds here, you would have to have more than 2 seconds, or you have to calculate the new pause using the previous timers. So in this case, if we want this message to appear 1 second after this message, you add 2 plus 1, which equals 3. It's a bit bothersome. There are other ways of doing it, but this is a very straightforward way, so you can use it. I can add a number of other topics, of course. The problem with this method is that the player doesn't know which things you can ask about. And that's, of course, a pretty major drawback. Some of the things will be straightforward because they might be objects in the game world, but not everything that you're talking about are objects. If you want to ask about the weather itself is not an object in the game world, which means that even if it's of course fairly straightforward to ask about the weather, the player doesn't know that you can ask about the weather. So how you hint about what the player can ask about is very important for the game structure and pacing. Otherwise, the player will probably get stuck, not knowing that the important information is just a few clicks away. Okay, so those are two different ways of doing this. There are alternatives to ask. We have tell and order, which are similar but slightly different, of course. I won't get into details about them here. I think it's enough just fiddling around with ask and talk to. If you would like to make complex branching conversations where you select in a menu the various things you would like to talk about, that's perfectly possible within the game engine. It's just that it's fairly complex, and I won't go into detail here about how to do that. But if you would like to, the tutorial is up on in the instructions, where you can use the tutorial on the page itself, the quest page, to learn about this. But as I said, it very quickly gets pretty hairy, so just be advised to not spend too much time doing that if you're not comfortable writing code.